John Brown was born May 9th, 1800, in Torrington, Connecticut. He was the fourth of 8 children. In 1805, the family moved to Hudson, Ohio, where his father opened a tannery. At the age of 16, Brown left his family and went to Plainfield, Massachusetts. He hoped to become a congressional minister, but money ran out and he suffered from eye inflammations, which forced him to give up the academy and return to Ohio. In Hudson, he worked briefly at his father's tannery before opening a successful tannery of his own outside of town with his adopted brother. In 1820, Brown married Diane Lusk. Their first child, John Jr., was born 13 months later. In 1825, Brown and his family moved to New Richmond, Pennsylvania, where he bought 200 acres of land. He cleared an eighth of it and built a cabin, a barn, and a tannery. Within a year, the tannery employed 15 men. Brown made money raising cattle and surveying. He also helped to establish a post office and a school. During this period, Brown operated an interstate business involving cattle and leather production along with Seth Thompson from eastern Ohio. In 1831, one of his sons died. Brown fell ill and his business began to suffer, leaving him in terrible debt. In the summer of 1832, shortly after the death of his newborn son, his wife Diane died. On June 14, 1833, Brown married 16-year-old Mary Ann Day, originally from New York. They eventually had 13 children, adding to the 7 children from his previous marriage. In 1832, Brown moved his family to Franklin Mills, Ohio. There he borrowed money to buy land in the area, building and operating a tannery. He suffered great financial losses in 1839. Like other determined men of his time and background, he tried many different business efforts in an attempt to get out of debt. Along with tanning hides and cattle trading, he also undertook horse and sheep breeding. Brown was declared bankrupt by a federal court on September 28, 1842. Brown had built a reputation as an expert in fine sheep and wool and entered into a partnership with Colonel Simon Perkins of Akron, Ohio, whose flocks and farms were managed by Brown and Sons. In 1846, Brown and his business partner, Simon Perkins, moved to the city of Springfield, Massachusetts. In Springfield, Brown found a community whose white leadership were deeply involved and emotionally invested in the anti-slavery movement. In 1847, after speaking at the Free Church, abolitionist Frederick Douglass spent a night speaking with Brown, after which he wrote, "From this night spent with John Brown in Springfield, Massachusetts, 1847, while I continued to write and speak against slavery, I became all the same less hopeful for its peaceful abolition. My utterances became more and more tinged by the color of this man's strong impressions." While in Springfield, as Brown learned more about abolitionism and the Underground Railroad, he also learned more about the region's mercantile elite. Brown later traveled to England to seek a higher price for Springfield's wool. The trip was a disaster, and the firm incurred a loss of $40,000, of which Colonel Perkins bore the larger share. With this misfortune, the Perkins and Brown Wool Commission operation closed in Springfield in late 1849. Subsequent lawsuits tied up the partners for several more years. Before Brown left Springfield in 1850, the United States passed the Fugitive Slave Act, a law which mandated that authorities in free states aid in the return of escaped slaves and imposed penalties on those who aided in their escape. In response, John Brown founded a militant group to prevent slaves' capture in Springfield. It was called the League of Gileadites. Upon leaving Springfield in 1850, Brown instructed the League of Gileadites to act quickly, quietly, and effectively to protect slaves that escaped to Springfield. In 1848, Brown heard of Gerrit Smith's Adirondack land grants to poor black men and decided to move his family among the new settlers. He bought land near North Elba, New York for $1 an acre and spent 2 years there. Brown left for Kansas, enlisting a son-in-law and making several stops just to collect funds and weapons. Brown and the free settlers were optimistic that they could bring Kansas into the Union as a slavery-free state. In August, a company of over 300 Missourians, under the command of Major General John W. Reed, crossed into Kansas and headed towards Osawatomie, Kansas, intending to destroy the Free State settlements there, and then marched to Topeka and Lawrence. On the morning of August 30th, 1856, they shot and killed Brown's son Frederick and his neighbor on the outskirts of the town. Brown, outnumbered more than 7-1, arranged his 38 men behind natural defenses along the road. Firing from cover, they managed to kill at least 20 of Reed's men and wounded 40 more. Reed regrouped, ordered his men to dismount and charge into the woods. Brown's small group scattered and fled across the river. One of Brown's men was killed during the retreat and 4 were captured. While Brown and his surviving men hid in the woods nearby, the Missourians plundered and burned Osawatomie. Despite being defeated, Brown's bravery and military shrewdness in the face of overwhelming odds brought him national attention and made him a hero to many. This incident was dramatized in the play Osawatomie Brown. By November 1856, Brown had returned to the East and spent the next 2 years in New England raising funds. Initially, Brown returned to Springfield, where he received contributions. A group of 6 wealthy abolitionists agreed to offer Brown financial support for his anti-slavery activities. They would eventually come to be known as the Secret Six and the Committee of Six. In the following months, Brown continued to raise funds. He received many pledges but little cash. In March, while in New York City, he was introduced to Hugh Forbes, an English mercenary, who had experience as a military tactician. Brown hired him to be a drill master for his men and to write their tactical handbook. Over several weeks, the two men put together a plan for fighting slavery in the South. In November, their troops left for Kansas. Forbes had not received his salary, so he returned to the East instead of venturing into Kansas. As the October election saw a free state victory, Kansas was quiet. Brown made his men return to Iowa, where he fed them tidbits of his Virginia scheme. In January 1858, Brown left his men in Springdale, Iowa, and set off to visit Frederick Douglass in Rochester, New York. There he discussed his plans with Douglass and reconsidered Forbes' criticisms. Brown and 12 of his followers, including his son Owen, traveled to Chatham, Ontario, where he convened on May the 10th a constitutional convention. And it was here that Brown was introduced to Harriet Tubman. Brown illuminated his plans to make Kansas, rather than Canada, the end of the Underground Railroad. Brown returned to Kansas in June, and he remained in the vicinity for 6 months. On December 20th, Brown led his own raid, in which he liberated 11 slaves, took captive 2 white men, and looted horses and wagons. As he began recruiting supporters for an attack on slaveholders, Brown was joined by Harriet Tubman. Her knowledge of support networks and resources in the border states of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware were invaluable to Brown and his planners. After he began his first battle, he believed slaves would rise up and carry out a rebellion across the South. He asked Harriet Tubman to gather former slaves then living in present-day southern Ontario, who might be willing to join his fighting force, which she did. Brown arrived in Harpers Ferry, Virginia, on July 3, 1859. In late August, he met with Frederick Douglass in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, where he revealed the Harpers Ferry plan. Douglass expressed severe reservations, rebuffing Brown's pleas to join the mission. In late September, Brown had only 21 men, 16 white, 3 free blacks, 1 freed slave, and a fugitive slave. They ranged in age from 21 to 49. On October 16, 1859, Brown, leaving 3 men behind as a rearguard, led 18 men in an attack on Harpers Ferry Armory. The armory was a large complex of buildings that contained 100,000 muskets and rifles, which Brown planned to seize and use to arm local slaves. As Frederick Douglass and Brown's family testified, his strategy was essentially to deplete Virginia of its slaves, causing the institution to collapse in one county after another, until the movement spread into the South, essentially wreaking havoc on the economic viability of the pro-slavery states. Initially, the raid went well, and they met no resistance entering the town. They cut the telegraph wires and easily captured the armory, which was being defended by a single watchman. They next rounded up hostages from nearby farms, including Colonel Lewis Washington, the great-grandnephew of George Washington. Things started to go wrong when an eastbound Baltimore and Ohio train approached the town. The train's baggage master tried to warn the passengers. Brown's men yelled for him to halt and then opened fire. The baggage master became the first casualty of Brown's war against slavery. Ironically, the baggage master was a freed black man. For some reason, after the shooting of the man, Brown allowed the train to continue on its way. News of the raid reached Baltimore early that morning, and then on to Washington, D.C. by late morning. In the meantime, local farmers, shopkeepers, and militia pinned down the raiders in the army by firing from the heights behind the town. Some of the local men were shot by Brown's men. At noon, Brown then moved his prisoners and remaining soldiers into a small brick building at the entrance of the armory called the engine house. He had the doors and windows barred, and loopholes were cut through the brick walls. The surrounding forces barraged the engine house, and the men inside fired back with occasional fury. Brown sent his son Watson and another supporter out under a white flag, but the angry crowd shot them. Intermittent shooting then broke out, and Brown's own son Oliver was wounded. His son begged his father to kill him and end his suffering, but Brown said, "If you must die, die like a man." A few minutes later, Oliver was dead. By the morning of October 18th, the engine house, later known as John Brown's Fort, was surrounded by a company of U.S. Marines under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee of the United States Army. A young Army Lieutenant, J.E.B. Stewart, approached under a white flag and told the raiders that their lives would be spared if they surrendered. Brown refused, saying, "No, I prefer to die here." Lieutenant Stewart then gave a signal. The Marines used sledgehammers and a makeshift battering ram to break down the engine room door. Lieutenant Israel Green cornered Brown and struck him several times, wounding his head. In 3 minutes, Brown and his survivors were captured. Although the attack had taken place on federal property, Brown and his men were tried in Virginia in Charlestown, just 7 miles west of Harpers Ferry. The trial began on October 27th, after a doctor pronounced the still wounded Brown fit for trial. Brown was charged with murdering 4 whites and a black, with conspiring with slaves to rebel, and with treason against Virginia. A series of lawyers were assigned to Brown. On November 2nd, after a week-long trial, the Charlestown jury found Brown guilty on all 3 counts. Brown was sentenced to be hung in public on December 2nd. Cadets from the Virginia Military Institute, under the leadership of General Francis H. Smith and Major Thomas J. Jackson, were called into service as a security detail in the event Brown's supporters attempted a rescue. On December 1st, his wife arrived by train in Charlestown, where she joined him at the county jail for his last meal. She was denied permission to stay the night, prompting Brown to lose his composure for the only time throughout the ordeal. On the morning of December 2nd, 1859, Brown wrote, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done." He read his Bible and wrote a final letter to his wife, which included his will. At 11 a.m., he was escorted from the county jail through a crowd of 2,000 soldiers a few blocks away to a small field where the gallows were. John Wilkes Booth, who borrowed a militia uniform to gain admission, and future Confederate General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson were at the execution. Brown was hung at 11:15 a.m. and pronounced dead at 11:50 a.m. His body was placed in a wooden coffin with the noose still around his neck. His coffin was then put on a train to take it away from Virginia to his family homestead in New York for burial. In the North, large memorial meetings took place. Church bells rang, guns were fired, and famous Northern writers praised Brown. On December 14, 1859, the U.S. Senate appointed a bipartisan committee to investigate the Harpers Ferry raid and to determine whether any citizens contributed arms, ammunition, or money to John Brown's men. The Democrats attempted to implicate the Republicans in the raid. The Republicans tried to disassociate themselves from Brown and his acts. The Senate committee heard testimony from 32 witnesses. The report, authored by Chairman James M. Mason, a pro-slavery politician from Virginia, was published in June 1860. It found no direct evidence of a conspiracy, but implied that the raid was a result of Republican doctrine. Republicans such as Abraham Lincoln rejected any connection with the raid. Lincoln called Brown insane after a heated exchange of insults. The raid on Harpers Ferry is generally thought to have done much to set the nation on a course toward a civil war. Southern slave owners, hearing initial reports that hundreds of abolitionists were involved, were relieved the effort was so small. Yet they feared other abolitionists would emulate Brown and attempt to lead slave rebellions. Therefore, the South reorganized the decrepit militia system. These militias, well established by 1861, became a ready-made Confederate army, making the South better prepared for the forthcoming war.